right, so back again now to talk about Lacan. This time his essay titled L'étourdit, but that has a whole meaning and we'll get into that. Before we actually jump in, I'm going to say that this is to be found or can be found in podcast form on Podbean and on iTunes and Spotify under the same name. There'll be links, obviously, for that. And there's Patreon for anyone that can do that. That'd be cool. If not, obviously don't feel obliged. But for now, I'm joined by Ben. I'm joined by Ben, who happens to actually know things about Lacan, and because I don't. So Ben, what do you do?
Yeah. Hey, so I am a fourth-year PhD student at the Center for Theory and Criticism at Western University. And I'm currently ABD and writing my PhD on Lacan and philosophy. But I work on Lacanian psychoanalysis with a background in the history of philosophy.
Cool. I'm not gonna make you say more. That sounded legit. All right. So this text is titled L'étourdit, which in French means, what does it mean? Dizzy?
Yeah,
nauseous?
It's something about turning. I'm not sure. I don't really speak French very well.
Yeah, it's a strange word because I think that when we were talking about it earlier, I made the joke that I wanted you to tell me what it was and tell me why I feel the way that it is.
You feel dizzy?
I feel dizzy when I'm reading this text. Because for those that haven't read it, it's extremely difficult. And for myself, who hasn't actually gotten into Lacan before, I found it really tricky. So what, for you, do you think would be like any preliminary details?
Well, this is... this text is sort of like a greatest hits of the late Lacan. There are several moments in over the course of Lacan's career where he consolidates what he calls his teaching. And this is sort of the final consolidation that it takes place. He writes this somewhere between seminar 20 or seminar 19 and seminar 20. And seminar 20 is sort of famous for finalizing the formulas of sexuation and is inaugurating the period that's called the latest Lacan.
Right.
And after this, he turns to the mathematical knots with the Bormian knot in a period that's increasingly becoming a topic of study for Lacanians, but is still highly contested, whether or not it's relevant and how it's relevant for analysis.
Yeah, because I went and did some other research on this, and really my knowledge of Lacan was limited, and I found this one explanation. I think it was the Stanford Encyclopedia one, which obviously is a good introductory thing, but anyone who might have more knowledge on the matter would contest some of their ideas. But someone, I can't remember the name of the person that wrote it, positioned Lacan at least in 3 stages.
Yeah.
To suggest that roughly in Lacan's thought there are 3 different Lacans: the early, middle, and late. And these 3 stages correspond roughly to the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. What can you say about that?
This is a pretty... Jacques Lacan comes up with this timeline of Lacan. He was writing about the imaginary in the 50s, which is up till about seminar 7, and then the symbolic in the 60s, and the real by the end in the 70s. And this is a helpful hermeneutic. No, that's not the right word. It's a helpful timeline, kind of.
A heuristic tool?
Heuristic, yeah. But I mean, I think it is misleading because he's like at all times he's dealing with all three registers, and by the end he's after like seminar 20 he's trying to thinking all three registers at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't.
So, okay, well, how do they work then? Roughly. Like these three registers, these three different
Yeah.
fields.
Yeah. So it is weird to think about like what is, or to even say like, oh, he's thinking about this one at this time or whatever. But so the symbolic imaginary real distinction is like, I think one of the most important things that Lacan introduces. So he distinguishes between the three registers of the unconscious, basically by introducing the symbolic. So we have the imaginary, which is just what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Like you can think of it as kind of like purely ideational. It's like the ego, it's fantasy, it's what he later calls semblance, but it's also the body.
Okay, how so?
So it's like the body as an image. So if you take his mirror stage essay, it's about the formation of the ego, right? But like what?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, formation of the ego, as you were saying.
Oh wait, are we going again?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the imaginary state, imaginary register, the register of the imaginary, has to do with fantasy and semblance and the ego and the body. And in the essay on the mirror stage, it's about the formation of the ego. But the ego, like, what you see when you look in the mirror is like your body. It's not yourself.
Yeah.
Really. Well, it is yourself, but your body. And that essay is all about like trying to create a semblance of like wholeness out of the fragmented body. And that's what the imaginary does fundamentally, is it tries to cover over these like contradictions and create a sense of wholeness. So like to give like a figure of the imaginary, it would be like the perfect like circle. Just
a circle.
Straight up.
Right.
And so much of the work of analysis is to articulate the imaginary.
Sure.
Bring it into words. And you realize that it doesn't make sense really and gets dispelled and stops playing effects.
Okay.
So like we have this experience like most, like when you're like worst fears and like things, like or we all have this experience where like you're anxious about something, but like as soon as you sit down and talk to it about with someone, you're like,
yeah,
that's like stupid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like it's ridiculous. And that's like basically that's like a snippet of the work of analysis. And so Freud distinguishes between like the pleasure principle and the reality principle, and Lacan starts articulating the real on as like neither. So you have to kind of set the real aside, and so we have the imaginary, and then the symbolic is like the linguistic register of the unconscious.
Sure.
And it like Lacan introduces it basically noticing that like what do we encounter in analysis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like what do you think we encounter in analysis, Dave?
Well, no, that makes sense to me because I think that this will lead into this essay specifically in a good way, because when he makes a distinction between what is said and what is meant in the act of saying, I think we're getting this sense that, you know, anything that anyone can come up with in the first instance is not necessarily something that the the analyst can take away from in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
And, without getting too much in my own personal stuff, this is something I've experienced a lot, where it takes work, and I'm not necessarily saying that this demands the intervention of an analyst. It might. But even if a person was coming to terms with their own stuff, I would only assume that it would take a great deal of time. And we are always, and this is the little bit I kind of understand of Lacan, is that with language, there'll always be a kind of deficit. Like, we'll always be met with a kind of barrier where there's an impasse, where we are unable to communicate what our feelings want, what our feelings might actually be, because they're so stubbornly individual, and any word out there doesn't do that job.
For sure.
So it's in that way that I see that, by how you described it, any kind of analysis of someone encounters that roadblock that is, the symbolic, and however it's affected or nailed into us through our schools or institutions or, what families, whatever. Yeah, I guess that's what I think about it. But
well, okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, this is a super interesting answer. I mean, because I asked, what do you think we encounter in analysis? And I expected you to just say your thoughts or your unconscious or something. But this is kind of a demonstration of precisely the confusion that early Lacan is really rallying against.
Oh damn! Did you just analyze me? Oh fuck.
That first off, that you have thoughts and feelings that are separable from language. That
right.
You run into language as kind of a block, or as an impossibility. But no, that's not true.
That's not true for Lacan?
Or
just generally?
Both.
Okay. All right.
Because it's through language that your thoughts and feelings and fantasies and desires get articulated and become sophisticated and what they are, as you have a fully fleshed out psychic life, and that only occurs via language. But we encounter that as we think that we are encountering that as a kind of block or kind of impossibility, that there's something more, there's some rich psychic life behind it all that you can't articulate. And that's precisely the imaginary trying to cover over the real, the impossible, which in l'étourdit and in Lacan goes by the name of there's no sexual relation.
Right. Yeah. But we'll get there.
Yeah.
We'll get there. So,
but
then, okay, that's good. To hop into this, he gives us two sentences almost right off the bat.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that these, I don't find it always clear, but it seems like throughout the whole essay, he's always making reference back to these two sentences. They seem to kind of form the crux of what he's saying. So let's read them. Number 1, and this is the translation. That one might be saying remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. So that's number 1. Mm-hmm. Now number 2, this enunciation, which appears to be an assertion, since it is produced in a universal form, is in fact modal, existential as such. So the subjunctive by which its subject is modulated, testifying to this. So what does that mean? if you know.
If I know. I feel like we should say that we're, as an aside, that we're using the Cormac-McGallagher translation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because there is no official translation of this text.
And Cormac his translation is not considered official?
No, he has bootleg translations of most of the seminar. I consider them bootleg.
Yeah.
But they're not translations of what gets. This is translated of what's printed in French because it's one of the écrits.
Right.
But the seminars are the ones that are published in French are first looked over by Jacques Lacan and there's lots of controversy around his versions. These are like straight from the recordings.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
better or worse.
Yeah.
But so we're working from that translation, not from the French.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so the first sentence, that one might be saying remains forgotten behind what is said and what is heard. Is like, so we're distinguishing between the fact of saying.
Yeah. See, because I understood it in the way that you were describing the symbolic presenting a barrier, where I understand this here as him describing that the thing, without necessarily defining it or illustrating it, that thing of what is spoken that doesn't actually come out in the words, nor is heard by the listening person, but is nevertheless there.
Yeah.
And I understood that as the task of the analyst is define that. So yeah, I don't know what you think.
Okay. Well, no. Yeah, I think you're on the right track. This is where we need the the analytic distinction between symbolic, imaginary, and real.
Right.
So
Sure.
we have the fact of saying is forgotten behind what is said and what is heard. So there's no to locate things in terms of the Bormian knot.
So what is the Bormian knot?
So it's basically like, well, okay, a Bormian knot is 3 rings that are tied together in like a triangle shape, such that if you cut any one ring, all 3 of them fall apart.
Sure.
So you need each one connects all 3, and none of them has primacy. And we use the Bormian knot to visualize the relation between the 3 registers.
The symbolic, the real, and the imaginary.
Yeah, so
the
you
imaginary,
have
symbolic, and real.
a section of overlap between symbolic and real,
Yeah.
real, imaginary, real, like between each of them. And then the object A is in the middle in all 3.
What is that?
That's you.
Okay. Oh my god.
But you're also like in the symbolic as a subject and in the imaginary as an ego. And you're between all 3 as desire. But so you find meaning and reality, the constitution of reality, in like the Kantian sense of like the subject constitutes reality.
Yep.
Located between the symbolic and the imaginary.
In between. So
Yeah.
they don't...
So in their overlap.
In their overlap. Okay.
So there's no meaning
Yeah.
without an intermixing of the imaginary.
And the symbolic.
Yeah.
Sure.
But so
Sure.
the fact of saying is purely symbolic.
Right. So
And then what is said and what is heard introduce meaning.
so that's reality. Meaning
Well,
is
it
where...
introduces the imaginary.
Okay. So what is said is the symbolic, or what is said and heard is the symbolic?
What is said?
What is said?
Yeah, you're just signifying. So is
Okay. What is said?
the fact of saying is purely symbolic.
And that produces meaning, which then presents a foray into the imaginary.
Yeah, so the way I would read it is you have a fact of saying, and then what is said is like the meaning that I'm trying to produce. What is heard would be the meaning that you like produce, the meaning that you produce.
Okay.
And they both follow from my fact of saying.
Okay.
And so the fact of saying is what you encounter in analysis. And so Lacan distinguishes between 2 levels of speech, between the level of the statement and the enunciation.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I speak at the level of the statement, but the unconscious speaks at the level of the enunciation.
Okay.
It's what's not said.
So the enunciation is what is not said.
Kind of. It's like what the unconscious says. Yeah.
What the unconscious says, so what the unconscious is saying?
Yeah, saying in what's in the fact of saying.
Saying. But it is not what is said.
Yeah, it's not what's stated.
Not what's like out there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or yeah. So the Yeah, and like in speaking, there are two levels of meaning. There, and this is like a basic Freudian distinction, like latent and or manifest and latent content of a dream,
Right. Yeah.
of like unconscious formations. Lacan recognizes that like these things only are effective once they're spoken.
Yeah.
And so in speech, you have the stated and the enunciated levels.
Sure. So for Lacan, then, and this is a bit of an aside, how can we make sense of pre-linguistic or non-linguistic, non-human actors? Well, that's a bad one. But like prior to language for humans, Lacan doesn't exist. There was no unconscious when there's no language.
Well, yeah, there's no. Well, the proper Lacanian response would be there's no prior to language. Like, first off, there is no unconscious without language. Full stop. The unconscious is an effect of speech.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
it's not a thing in itself.
Yeah. Well, and it's not like a psychical entity.
Yeah.
Like behind consciousness.
Right. Right.
That's Lacanians will constantly say the unconscious is a misnomer. It's a misnomer.
So,
but
for this second sentence, then, when he says that this enunciation, which appears to be an assertion, since it is produced in a universal form, is in fact modal, existential as such. When he's talking about this enunciation, is he talking about, to use it in a very vulgar way, the language of the unconscious, or the enunciation belonging to the unconscious as being the saying of the unconscious?
Okay, well, here I think I'm going to make a leap of judgment. We're talking, like, he's trying to get us to the formulas of sexuation. So when we say this enunciation appears as an assertion produced in a universal form, we're talking about the phallic function.
Okay. What is that?
So the phallic function is the phallus is the phi, the Greek letter.
Okay, yeah. It's like
so phi x.
The sideways egg with a little line through it.
Well, a circle with a line through it.
It looked like more of a sphere. Whatever.
Yeah. I mean, a sphere is a circle.
Okay. Fine, Ben. Fine.
Okay.
An ellipsis.
But
ellipsy.
The phallic function is basically the signifier for castration. Okay. So it's a signifier. Castration is the fact of being subject to the unconscious. So the fact of, as soon as you speak, you're subject to the unconscious. So all speaking beings are subjects to, have a subject of the unconscious, and the phallic function is a signifier without meaning. It's purely symbolic, and it touches on the real.
Okay.
And so it operates only in the unconscious.
But okay. So, but the phallic function also, as you just mentioned, deals with castration, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that castration is also signified with that image of the circle with the line through it, right?
Yeah, the phi.
Now, connecting the phi to the unconscious is, or it's an empty signifier in that it's an impossibility.
So it operates in the place of an impossibility in the symbolic.
Because the impossibility is reserved for the real?
Well, so the symbolic impossibility is the real. And so,
okay.
But so yeah, I mean, you kind of have to get everything like in play at once.
So yeah, that's a good point then. You mentioned we go from here. Are you setting it up for us to get to the project of sexuation, or the various different, what was the term you used? Steps, or
the formula of sexuation.
Formula of sexuation. Mm-hmm. How do we get from this, then these two sentences to there?
So the leap is from the fact that there are speaking beings to the fact that there are two sexes. And so when we talk about two sexes, we mean something different than purely like biological sex. We're not talking about like your genitals.
Okay.
And we're not talking about gender either. We're not talking about identity.
Sure.
So there is room in Lacanian psychoanalysis for transgender phenomenon and like all sorts of variation. And it's like there's a frequent refrain that like there are like men are women in the Lacanian sense and women are men in the Lacanian sense. We're talking about, so sexuation is different than sex and gender.
Okay. All right.
It's about the modality of like the subject of the unconscious. So, and there are only two logical possibilities that correspond, that are like, so you have a masculine subject of the unconscious who is an all, or a feminine subject who is not all.
Okay.
So we're trying to get from the fact that there are speaking beings to the contingency of there are two kinds of speaking beings.
Right. Okay. So, insofar as this is to be found in the unconscious, we cannot limit it to that alone. Because you're saying from these speaking beings, it seems as though even on the surface, and I'm not trying to say that this this correlates with like gender identity or genitalia.
Yeah.
But that does it then manifest itself to some extent on the surface? Like, is there a way that in what is said and what is heard, we can see this?
I mean, there is like, it's always kind of frustrated me, this refrain that like your like masculine or feminine like sexuation is totally contingent. It's like we can say like because it is, but then it begs the question, or it leads to the question like, well, okay, why is like one form of a subject masculine and the other form feminine? And you do have to like presume that like, well, like there were probably way more men walking into the clinic that had a masculine subject of the unconscious.
Okay.
Way more women that had a feminine subject of the unconscious. And there's no necessary connection between like your junk or your identity or your like unconscious. But there is a correlation.
Okay.
That is explainable only on an individual basis.
Okay. What does that look like?
It looks like psychoanalyzing your personal history.
Right, but then wouldn't it?
And I mean, there's not really you can't really answer how someone becomes a masculine or a feminine like subject of the unconscious.
Yeah.
That's the point, is it's contingent. And it's how at some moment in time you had to respond to language castrating you.
Okay. So, but all right, I can get on board with that. But I feel like I have to follow up with that, because you said if we're dealing with personal history to some extent, and this becomes almost a stubbornly individualistic affair, which psychoanalysis has to be, right? Then it seems as though it demands a necessary evaluation of the various institutions that we exist in on a daily basis. So my question would be, how much do those actually affect, the determination of someone as, the occupying a masculine unconscious or a feminine unconscious?
Yeah. Well, like, first off, we should just, like, note that, like, there is, only through Lacanian psychoanalysis is there, like, room to analytically talk about how the social operates on the unconscious, on the individual, and that's because the symbolic order. is an aspect of, or is like what structures the unconscious. It's one of the three like fundamental registers. So how you couldn't say, and I don't know if you could say in any straightforward way that like these institutions sexuate you in this or that way, they produce this or that effect, because of the like structuring effects that get produced on you are like so contingent, and you're so young, and they have to do with like what sticks.
Yeah.
What sticks when you're little, when you're an infant. But undoubtedly, like some do more than others. And I don't have like, I'm not a practicing analyst. I don't have like these kinds of answers, but I know, I mean, I do know that like there is a frequent, or like from the literature I've read, like analysts are constantly worried, are like, because Lacan always talks about like the decline of the father, the name of the father, the decline of like authority figures, and analysts are constantly worried about like so the decline of a figure that castrates is what the father is, more or less. So a figure that institutes the unconscious.
Right.
And analysts are constantly worried, is this going to create psychotic subjects?
What will? Like, with the loss of the
Yeah, if there's no one
father.
to say no. To say, like, no, like, to lay down the law of desire.
Yeah.
And that comes before sexuation, I think.
The being
so registering that you've been subjected to the unconscious.
Right.
So bringing in the phallic function as a signifier.
Right. But
that
you're
sexuation
always
responds to.
But the way you phrased that, it was as though that happens before you're aware of it, not you. It doesn't happen before it actually happens.
Yeah. So we're dealing not with like time in like the sense that we experience consciously, but like structural temporality.
Okay.
So it's logical time is what Lacan calls it, an very early essay. So it's basically like this has to happen before that has to happen before that.
Right.
So like,
does he? This is obviously a simple question, but does he kind of temporalize it in a way that's understandable? Like, does he say around 9 months the child is born?
That's exactly what he wants to get away from.
Okay, so that's a move away from the Freudian.
The like stages of the erotic zone. He wants to talk about.
Interesting.
Because in psychoanalysis, the diagnostic criteria, there are like three general categories: psychosis, perversion, and neurosis.
Right.
And so, like, developmentally, like, you're either psychotic, perverse, or neurotic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, each of them has to do with, like, your relation to the big other. So, which is...
What's that?
The big other is the name of the symbolic order.
But that's not synonymous with, like, the castrating...
Yeah, it's the name of the symbolic order, insofar as... we fantasize it as a whole, as complete.
Okay.
Which we necessarily do.
So is it like an ideal ego for like not us?
No, it's the big other.
Oh my god. All right, let me try to think about this for a second.
I mean, I think like when we think about like what is the big other, like the place to start is in like the naive sense.
The big other, the thing that is not me,
is
greater
something
than
it's
me?
like God. It's like ideological.
Okay.
It's like the big, like the guy that makes sense of everything for me.
But it is not the father.
It is. It's totally the father. It's
okay.
not the father. But I mean, it's like could be like the father.
So, it seems to me that from that, the big other is something that you kind of, you don't model yourself after, but it's something that you've grown to kind of generate yourself in distinction to it.
Mm-hmm. It has to. Well, it is because it is the symbolic order. It has to appear as other, And so
Yeah.
this movement from towards like otherness, because it also, the symbolic language, like we said, like regulates desire.
Okay.
So like it has to appear as an other is regulating my desire.
Yeah.
And when it doesn't appear, that language, like, because obviously language is external to us. We're neurotics. We know that.
Right.
The psychotic doesn't.
Okay, because that's the fear that the analysts have. Like, if we lose you mentioning specifically the loss of the kind of authority figure, father,
Yeah.
or anything other.
Something to like strictly say no and strictly
Right.
make that separation
Yeah.
for you as an infant.
Yeah.
It becomes harder to externalize the symbolic order.
Right. So when we think about the mirror stage then, and I think that this is probably the text most people are familiar with, we think of the moment the child sees himself in a mirror,
For sure.
separate from anything else.
Yeah.
But by what you're saying, that seems like that's not the only thing going on. It seems like it would be impossible for a child to actually recognize themselves as on their own. Like,
Yeah.
they wouldn't be able to do that themselves.
Well, yeah, to recognize themselves, to recognize that it's them.
Because, not only do you have all these other kind of abstract forces working on them in some way via this kind of, like, relative positionality in terms of the big other, but
Yeah.
you also seem to need, like, a kind of, like a direct intervention almost, like that father figure, that's actually
Yeah.
not punishing, but guiding.
Well, you need, like, in a very, because in the mirror stage essay, he characterizes it in terms of the infant looking in the mirror. The infant has, like, experience of itself as, like, I can't control my limbs.
Right.
It's like, it's a fragmented body, but what it sees in the mirror is a whole.
Right.
A whole body that seems to have control over itself.
Right.
And what he later develops in the seminars, I don't remember which one, that there does kind of have to be someone there to point out, like, no, you are that image. You're the one in the mirror. So a parental figure makes
Sure.
the connection for you with language.
Right. Yeah, and that facilitates your being entered into that kind of contract of language,
And so Lacan is interested in, like, the structural implications of this, and not so much the individual, like, details of, like, is it like
Sure.
your mom or your dad that says that, or like
Yeah.
what's going on? Is the water in the background? Or
It's just the
like,
big other.
yeah,
It's greater than
it's
you.
just like someone's there
Yeah.
and says, and does it via a signifying function,
Right.
not necessarily linguistic, but like signifies for you.
Yeah.
No, you are that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the elementary definition of the signifier.
Right.
It signifies the subject for another signifier.
Okay, wait a second. So the signifier signifies the subject for another signifier.
Yes. Instead of like the Caesarean usual way of thinking of it, was the signifier signifies some external meaning, like something in the world,
Yeah.
for another signifier.
Yeah.
It signifies, because in Caesar, he's like constantly, not constantly, but he's like, no, the signifier signifies like an idea,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
but it always
Yeah. Yeah.
doesn't
yeah,
signify an objective idea, not some like naive Platonic ideal in God, like in God's mind or something, in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So but really it signifies you,
Yeah. Okay.
the speaking subject.
Okay. So say it again, then how Lacan reimagines that.
This signifier signifies the subject for another signifier.
So the first part of that, the signifier signifies the subject, seems to follow from the Saussure thing, because we don't, we aren't using these signifiers to communicate the language of God or some ideal. In fact, it's doing, we can find out a lot about ourselves from these signifiers.
Yeah.
So that part, all right, from the Saussure, the signifier signifies the subject, which then...
And then it can only... so the whole point of Saussurian linguistics is that language takes on meaning synchronically So it all at once. So
Yep.
each signifier only has meaning in terms of like insofar as there are all the other signifiers.
Yeah.
So like basically you have to be able to say what the meaning is.
Right. Okay.
So like the subject is always a barred subject. It's always a lack in the symbolic order, which is where object A and desire and jouissance
The object
exists.
A encircled in the Bromian knot of the real, imaginary, and the symbolic.
Yeah. So you get inserted in this lack between signifiers.
Okay. All right. So what is that? Okay, because there's something from this text that I want to bring up I think in relation to that. How do we make sense then of his refusal to acknowledge a meta language? There is no meta language.
There is no meta language.
Why is there no meta language?
Because there's no big other.
Ever?
I mean, yeah.
But I thought you needed the big other to like.
Well, because the big other does not exist.
Okay.
But there is a big other.
The big other is there, but it doesn't.
Yeah, the big other is there insofar as you respond to it. It's there, like, as a fantasy, but as, like, a purely, like, symbolic. Like, there's no. The point of both sayings, there is no big other, which is, like, one of the fundamental parts of, like, feminine sexuality. Because the woman is the big other. Is the other in the sexual relation.
In relation to man.
Well, man makes her the other.
Okay.
But, so. But she knows there's no big other. But basically it means that, like, there's no big other, there's no meta language. It means there's no totality of the symbolic order. There's no way of speaking about language from outside of language. No way of speaking about it, like, you could say, like, objectively, like, from, like, a God's eye point of view, subspecies aeternitatis, anything like that.
Yeah.
You're always already in language. And even talking about language, you're, like, in the symbolic.
He's just completing
So-
Kant's system. Like, he's
Well, it's because Kant is right.
just Kant.
In, like, a very basic sense. That if Kant's not right, then we're psychotic.
But, like, I think that there is a certain amount of credence, or there is a certain potential to that, because it doesn't, posit there to be that, if the big other was actually manifest in some form or other, you couldn't help but think that would then generate some other kind of, like, extreme version of like inferiority that would make the human just, like, inoperable. Like, if that thing was out there, you just, like, how would you exist? Because it'd be like going to kings, and I don't know, that was going to be a bad analogy.
No, it would be, I mean, the big other grounds are reality too. It's like, this is the kind of naive, like, Renaissance, pre-Enlightenment, like, worldview of that, like, God, like, literally introduces meaning into the world and, like, defines our words for us, and, like, the definitions of our words correspond to the things that we encounter. So, like, if you want to say there's a big other, this is the kind of worldview that you're getting at. But, like, what's useful about the concept of the big other, and you find this in, like, Zizek makes, like, great use of this concept with ideology.
Okay.
The big other takes on different ideological forms and different formations, operates in different ways, like the fatherland, the motherland, and things like that. And, like, the whole point is, like, Lacan's point is that, like, no matter what you want to say the big other is, there is no big other. But it still, like, produces these material effects.
Sure.
At the level of the social.
Sure.
Not just at the level of like psychotic delusion, not just at the level of your individual fantasies, but what we do in our social relations.
Right.
And like that's kind of ties into the 4 discourses too.
Right. What are the 4 discourses?
What are 4 discourses? Well, so long as you're in the master's discourse, you're serving the big other at the very least. And you kind of always are.
Okay, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? So, okay, the 4 discourses are the master, university, hysteric,
and the analyst discourse. The
Analyst.
analytic discourse.
Analytic discourse.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and give you the theory of the 4 discourses.
Yeah. You don't need to delineate that in like a very clear way. But what do you mean when you say the master discourse fits in with the big other?
So,
subordinate.
The 4 discourses are the discourse is basically what Freud means by civilization. When in civilization and its discontents, or in like group psychology or something like that, it's a social link.
Right.
So there are 4 kinds of social link. And like whether or not there's like a 5th is like Lacan mentions capitalist discourse in television. My supervisor, Alan Perrow, has like a great article about the economic discourse that's more convincing. But so all of the discourses are social link. And so there are 4 terms in the discourse. S1, the master signifier. S2, the battery of signifiers. So every signifier but the master signifier.
Okay.
So like for Lacan, there's the signifying chain, which is the signifiers taken diachronically. So like when we speak in time, they're one after the other.
Yep.
The signifying battery is all the signifiers at once. So like the dictionary is like literally all the signifiers at once.
Yeah.
And then the 3rd term is Bard S, the subject.
Okay.
The subject who's subject to the unconscious, and object A, the object cause of desire, which is real.
And it's encircled by the real, imaginary, and the symbolic.
It's the other side of the Bard S. So you're really in 2 positions, Bard S and object A. But object A's are also in the world. So like your cell phone is an object A because you enjoy it.
Okay.
So where were we going with this?
Well, I was going to ask the following, and this gets into the second section of this, because I was specifically wondering about what he meant by Freud saying, and what is that? How does that relate to this meta-language, or this impossible meta-language? Because it would seem to me, and I don't know for sure, but I think
Be more confident.
Lacan would be like, Freud is just trying to find this meta-language. Freud is just trying to get at this possible big other in the form of like, and there's no one Freud. Like Freud changed his mind a lot, but like it seemed like the project was getting at that kind of possibility, to which, by what you're saying, Lacan is a lot more suspicious of. So when he says Freud's saying here, what is he saying about Freud?
Well, no. You got... Okay, I thought you should be confident, but you got Freud all wrong.
Thank you.
So, Freud is saying there's no meta-language.
Okay.
And there's no sexual relation.
Okay. The first part I understand, but now the second, you lost me with that now.
Well, they're the same.
Okay, wait. Sexual relation and meta-language are the same.
No sexual relation.
No sexual relation and meta-language is the same.
And there's no meta-language.
So, oh my god.
It's the non-relation. Then, like, it leads to symbolic impossibility. So, but that's kind of everything at once. So, moving on to page 2.
Page 2.
Yeah, I mean, so in this essay, like, it is weird. Section 2 is called Freud Saying, and then he talks about math.
Yes, the matheme and whatnot.
And so, as far as I know, Freud does not talk about math. So,
Yeah,
like, I just want to, like, put that out there.
Yeah, the one Freud essay I've read.
Yeah, no, I don't remember any math. So, but what Freud does talk about, like, what Lacan, like, Freud makes the unconscious speak. And so we can talk about, like, the proof of this, or we can talk about this in several ways. So, like, there are the case studies, which at least Badiou at least characterizes as kind of like they're the proof that we have that, like, there is psychoanalysis,
Right.
or at least there was psychoanalysis. And you have to presuppose for all of this that there is psychoanalysis,
Fair.
which contemporary discourse does not, for the most part. Like, our discourse around, like, neuroscience, that everything's reducible to the brain,
Yeah.
to
Okay.
like firing neurons, to like biology, that everything's explainable, forecloses the statement that there is psychoanalysis.
Sure. That makes
So-
sense to me. Yeah, that's fair.
What do we mean, like, and like, it's hard to deny that there are, like, unconscious thoughts, unconscious desires, and things like that, and, like, these remain explainable in terms of the brain or evolution, even if poorly explained. But so what Freud introduces introduces language and sex into the unconscious, and the sexuality as the point of as the kind of unarticulable point. Here, Lacan talks about it as absence, the lack of sense,
Right.
which is precisely the real, right? If we recall the Borromean knot, what's excluded from the symbolic and the imaginary
It's the real.
is sense in the real. But so the absence still produces effects on language.
So
we
okay,
keep-
so the imaginary and the symbolic exclude sense.
No, they make sense.
They make sense. So it's the lack of sense that
Yeah, the absence
is complicit
Is-
with the real.
is real.
Is real. Okay.
But it
Right.
manifests in the symbolic as an impossibility. That produces effects. It's productive in the way that, like, this is like Zizek's whole project to show that it's akin to, like, a Hegelian dialectic. It's dialectically productive. That the impossibility produces signifying and effects and produces jouissance effects.
Okay.
So, like, you enjoy speaking.
Yeah.
Your enjoyment follows, like, a linguistic structure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So what Freud introduces is sexuality as more than, like, intercourse, is more than, like, banging. And, like, he can't help, like, if you read the 3 essays on sexuality, like, he returns again and again to, like, it's, like, polymorphously perverse, it's, like, we can't pin it down. And Lacan wants to say it's absence, it's real.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the erogenous zones are, like, inarticulable, unimaginable, things like that. So that's what we're trying to get at, the inarticulable, unimaginable. And Lacan, that's what the phallic function covers over,
Okay.
but the phallic function is, we only ever deal with the phallic function. We use it in our sexuation. And like what it really manifests as in our like in the clinic and so in our lives is like the non-relation, the sexual non-relation,
which is where the real is possible.
Well, which is the impossible that is the real. And the whole point of the Lacanian real, which I think this is one of my favorite authors, Alenka Zupanchik, says the whole point of the Lacanian real is that the impossible happens.
Okay. How?
So sexual, so like in a kind of, in the smallest sense, sexual, like there is no sexual relation, but we still fall in love.
Sure. So how I understand that is that it's like, it's utopian, and the reason I say that is because, and this is going to Freud, like from the age of 0, you are a sexual being, and that sexuality is something that you are taught in so many different ways to get rid of. And in order for you to enter into the kind of a social contract, because taking from Lacan, that is exactly what it, is constituted by the symbolic, you must engage with that to some extent. You must come to terms with that. So to imagine something totally otherwise, and that's how I'm gathering it.
No, you're good.
Okay. It demands that you must somehow renounce what you cannot renounce, that is sexuality, that precedes you in many ways, and that, subtends your character, that is you, in order to arrive at this possibility that, as you just said, imagine that. Love without sex, or having that you not being condemned to our flesh prisons.
Whoa. Yeah.
I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I mean, like, I want to say, when we talk, like, that love happens is, like, you could almost call it, like, the hard problem for psychoanalysis. Because it shouldn't.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so, like, a lot of, well, it shouldn't, like, it happens in transference, but, like, a love relation happens between people. But, like, everything about sexuality brings us back to, like, the polymorphously perverse subject. And, like, the subject's desire, the subject's making a, like, desired object and enjoying, and a lot of these repressive discourses that, like, say, like, a Foucauldian would pick up on, are trying to reduce all the possibility, are repressing different sexual possibilities to, like, intercourse, to, like, what is most easily a semblance of sexual relation.
Right.
And so the Lacanian question is, like, we're not saying, like, don't have sex.
Yeah.
We're not saying that this isn't important, but that a relation occurs by other means.
Yeah.
Including sexuality, including all the things that we normally think. Like, that a relation first off, it occurs contingently.
Right.
So it's impossible and contingent, and these are these are logical modalities, opposed to necessity and possibility.
Sure.
And that's the real.
So we get that right at the beginning, almost, when in the second sentence, when he's saying that we think it's a universal form when it is in fact modal.
Yeah. And so it's like, that's where, to, like, kind of get off topic, that's where I like Badiou's, like, conception of love as, like, a universal truth that creates a subject too.
Okay.
Because, like, Lacanian psychoanalysis has a hard time talking about love outside of the transference, outside of, like, the love of the analyst. And, like, for Badiou, like, if love is an eternal truth, it, like, becomes the subject itself.
Yeah.
Like, It's a kind of like modality of subjectivity.
That's interesting. Well, shit. Here, we're rounding. That's good. All right, we're rounding an hour right now. An hour. That's good. All right, so we're going to pause that there. We're going to take a break, and we'll continue this on in the next one.
Page 5.
Are we that far? Really? I'm impressed.
Page 4?
Yeah, no, something like that. All right, for those that listen this far, thank you, and tune in